There comes a juncture in life when the dynamic between parents and offspring undergoes a significant transformation. For decades, you dedicate yourself to nurturing them, offering guidance and making sacrifices on their behalf. However, a realization dawns upon you. A shift has occurred. Perhaps your counsel is disregarded, your viewpoints are dismissed, or even more disheartening, you are made to feel like an encumbrance. This can be profoundly painful. If your children have begun to treat you with a level of deference that falls short of what you merit, you may experience frustration, even resentment. The urge to remind them of your past sacrifices, of the years devoted to prioritizing their needs, might be strong. However, succumbing to anger will not rectify the situation. In fact, it often exacerbates it. Instead, there exists a more efficacious method to reclaim their respect without resorting to conflict, disagreements, or animosity. I will now share 6 actions you can implement when your children display a lack of respect. These represent potent adjustments, subtle modifications in your responses that can fundamentally alter their perception of you. Some of these may be surprising, but by the end, you will grasp how to re-establish yourself as a respected and valued figure in their lives. Let us begin with action 1. Cease seeking their validation. One of the most prevalent errors parents commit, particularly as they advance in years, is striving excessively to gratify their children. You may have observed this tendency in yourself, going to great lengths to accommodate them, acquiescing when you desire to decline, prioritizing their needs above your own, in the hope that your efforts will elicit greater appreciation. However, the harsh truth is that the more you pursue their approval, the less respect they will accord you. Respect is not acquired through self-sacrifice, it is cultivated through self-regard. If you consistently bend over backward, perpetually yield, and constantly attempt to maintain harmony, you are implicitly conveying that your emotions are of secondary importance. Once this belief takes root, it becomes facile for them to take you for granted. I once knew a woman named Margaret, a resilient and self-reliant individual in her youth. However, as she aged, she relinquished decision-making power to her children. She restructured her schedule to accommodate their requirements, suppressed her opinions, and even disregarded their condescending remarks. "I simply want to maintain family unity," she confided in me. However, the outcome was that her children ceased to value her. They perceived her as someone who would invariably adjust, always concur, and perpetually remain silent. She believed she was preserving peace, but in reality, she was forfeiting her voice. If your children do not respect you, the initial step is not to demand it, but to cease behaving as though you require it. Establish boundaries, decline when necessary, and voice your thoughts, even if they are unpalatable to them. For the moment you begin to respect yourself, they will begin to perceive you differently, and in due course, that respect will be reciprocated. Action 2. Refrain from arguing. Lead by example. When your children disregard your opinions, interrupt you, or treat you disrespectfully, your initial inclination may be to argue, to remind them of your past deeds, or to demand their attention. However, let me share a piece of advice that can spare you years of frustration. Argumentation is futile. Reflect on the last instance when you successfully persuaded someone to respect you through conflict. Respect is not attained through rhetoric. It is cultivated through presence, through your demeanor, through the manner. The appropriate response when others attempt to test your resolve is crucial. Reacting to disrespect with anger only validates their perception that they hold sway over you. Consider the example of Frank, a retired educator. He spent his career commanding a classroom, yet his adult children began to treat him with indifference. His guidance was disregarded, his concerns dismissed, and his attempts to correct them occasionally met with laughter. Initially, he engaged in arguments, striving to reassert his worthiness of their regard. However, the more he contested, the worse the situation became. Then, Frank implemented a significant shift. Instead of arguing, he committed to active listening. He ceased pursuing respect through verbal means and instead conducted himself with the self-assurance of someone who already possessed it. He communicated with calmness and wisdom, devoid of the need to dominate the conversation. Gradually, his children took notice. They observed a man who wasn't desperate for their approval, who felt no compulsion to prove himself, and who simply embodied strength. If your children exhibit a lack of respect, avoid engaging in combative behavior. Instead, demonstrate what respect entails through your own actions. Uphold your dignity, communicate with conviction, and above all, refrain from stooping to their level. When you maintain your composure with grace, they will sense it, and in due course, they will emulate your example. Withdrawing your emotional reliance is a fundamental lesson to learn as you mature. You cannot rely on your children to satisfy your emotional needs. While your love for them may be profound, and you may yearn for their affection and respect in return, the moment they perceive that you need them to feel validated, the power dynamic within the relationship undergoes a change. The truth is that individuals, including your own children, tend to respect those who demonstrate emotional self-sufficiency. When you depend on them for validation, affection, or attention, it places undue pressure on them. Instead of feeling appreciative, they may begin to feel burdened. This can lead to them distancing themselves, exhibiting impatience, or even displaying irritation. The more intensely you pursue their love, the less freely they will offer it. I recall a woman named Helen, a compassionate mother who dedicated her life to her children. As they matured and became preoccupied with their own lives, she found herself anxiously awaiting their calls. When they didn't call, she would initiate contact, often excessively. She would remind them of how much she missed them and express her desire for more frequent visits. However, instead of drawing them closer, it had the opposite effect. They began to perceive her calls as an obligation rather than something to anticipate. Then, Helen made a deliberate change. She stopped waiting and stopped initiating calls. Instead, she redirected her focus to herself, exploring new hobbies, socializing with friends, and prioritizing her personal happiness. Surprisingly, her children started calling more frequently. They began to respect her time, recognizing her as an individual with a fulfilling life of her own. The core message is straightforward. The less you rely on your children to make you feel needed, the more they will value your presence, when you demonstrate that you can stand strong independently. When you stand strong and self-reliant, others will begin to regard you, not out of obligation, but from a genuine place of admiration for the life you've thoughtfully constructed. Action. 4. Establish and uphold boundaries. One primary reason children may lose esteem for their parents is the parents' failure to establish and maintain appropriate boundaries. If you permit your children to engage in disrespectful communication, disregard your viewpoints, or act as though your time and emotions hold no significance, they will persist in such conduct. This isn't necessarily because they are inherently disrespectful individuals, but because people, especially within familial contexts, tend to treat you in accordance with what you passively allow. Setting limits doesn't necessitate severing ties with your offspring or instigating discord. Rather, it entails calmly and resolutely determining the specific behaviors you will and will not accept. Critically, it involves actively enforcing these boundaries when they are violated. I recall a gentleman named Robert, a retired executive who had spent his career leading a business with resolve and assurance. However, in his interactions with his adult children, he encountered difficulties. They would interrupt him mid-sentence, dismiss his opinions, and even critique his lifestyle choices. Initially, he tolerated this conduct, rationalizing that confrontation wasn't worth the trouble. However, he came to realize that each instance of remaining silent inadvertently communicated to them that their behavior was acceptable. Consequently, Robert altered his approach. When his son interrupted him, he calmly stated, "I will resume speaking when you are ready to listen." When his daughter dismissed his viewpoint, he simply responded, "You are not obligated to agree with me, but I do expect you to be respectful." When they persisted in pushing his boundaries, he made it unequivocally clear that if they couldn't accord him basic respect, he would refrain from spending time with them. The result was transformative. They began to listen. Initially, there was resistance, but over time, they recognized their father's unwavering resolve. They understood that he valued himself sufficiently to demand respect, and consequently, they began to grant it. If your children exhibit disrespect, it's imperative to examine whether you are inadvertently enabling it. If you neglect to establish boundaries, they won't create them for you. And if you don't advocate for yourself, no one else will. Action 5. Cease giving without acknowledgement. One of the surest paths to eroding respect is to consistently give to those who fail to acknowledge or appreciate your contributions. As parents, we often fall into this pattern, extending our time, energy, and support even when it goes unacknowledged, is taken for granted, or is met with entitlement. However, the reality is that giving to someone who doesn't value it doesn't foster affection or respect. It cultivates expectation. They cease to view your kindness as something precious and begin to perceive it as an entitlement. The moment you cease providing, they don't express gratitude, they express inconvenience. I once knew a man named George, a father who had consistently been generous with his children. He readily provided financial assistance whenever they required it, dropped everything to assist them, and even restructured his life to accommodate their needs. Yet instead of gratitude, he encountered complaints. They rarely verbalized, "Thank you." It was expected that they would show more consideration, and the most disheartening aspect was that when assistance was genuinely needed, they were unavailable. Then, George initiated a transformation. He ceased overextending his efforts, stopped providing help before it was even requested, and crucially, began declining requests when necessary. Initially, his offspring exhibited dissatisfaction. They struggled to comprehend why he was no longer going to extreme lengths for their benefit. However, as time passed, a noteworthy alteration occurred. They commenced valuing his time and appreciating his endeavors, as they suddenly grasped that his benevolence was not inexhaustible, but rather a precious gift, not an automatic entitlement. If you perceive a lack of regard for your time, effort, or generosity from your children, consider taking a step back. Examine whether you are giving excessively and contemplate the potential repercussions of ceasing this behavior. By conveying that your generosity is contingent upon respect, you encourage them to treat it accordingly. Another crucial action is to cultivate a life independent of them. Demonstrating that your contentment is not solely dependent on them is a potent method for regaining their esteem. While parental devotion to children, making them the focal point of existence, is natural, this dynamic undergoes a transformation as we mature. If you have consistently prioritized them throughout your life, they might perceive you as someone lacking other pursuits. Individuals who possess a distinct purpose, interests, and sense of fulfillment garner respect. If your children perceive that you rely on them for amusement, validation, or significance, they may feel restricted or worse, view you as someone with no personal life. Consider the example of Eleanor, a widow in her late 70s. Following her husband's passing, she dedicated herself entirely to her children's lives, maintaining constant contact, offering unsolicited advice, and anticipating them to fill the void left by her husband. However, instead of fostering closeness, it created distance. Their visits became less frequent, their calls shorter, and Eleanor felt increasingly isolated. Subsequently, she made a conscious decision to enroll in a book club, embark on travels with companions, and volunteer at a local community center. She discontinued making her children the epicenter of her existence, and an extraordinary occurrence transpired. Her children initiated more frequent communication, expressing curiosity about her activities, admiring her self-reliance, and respecting her as an individual. Reflect on whether your children perceive you as someone leading a complete, meaningful existence, or as someone passively awaiting their attention. By demonstrating that you are actively living rather than merely existing, you will elicit a fundamentally different perception from them. Respect is not something that can be demanded, but it's something you inspire through your actions, your boundaries, and the way you live. Should they exhibit diminished care, consideration, or respect, refrain from expending energy on anger. Instead, modify your strategy by ceasing the pursuit of their approval. Paradoxically, the less you require it, the more readily they will offer it. Lead by setting an example, as your self-respect speaks volumes. Detach yourself from emotional reliance. Cultivate independence, as increased self-sufficiency garners greater respect. Establish firm limits, because others will only value you to the extent you demand. Cease unwarranted giving, for unacknowledged generosity diminishes in significance. Most importantly, cultivate an existence independent of them. Individuals admire those with a distinct aim, individual happiness, and inherent contentment. By adopting these principles, a noteworthy transformation occurs. Your children's perception of you shifts. They will no longer see you as someone awaiting their focus, but as a person who commands esteem through their very being. Eventually, that esteem will be reciprocated, not through explicit demand, but through earned merit. We appreciate your participation today. We are eager to learn from you. Please share in the comments a key takeaway and its planned implementation. Your perspectives are vital, so do not hesitate to express them. Reading your feedback is deeply motivational and encouraging to us. If you appreciated this presentation and found it valuable, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support enables us to produce further informative and inspiring content. We extend our gratitude for watching and anticipate seeing you in our future productions.